Okay, so I'm excited to open this conference, first session of the conference. Loss preservation, biotechnologies, and life sciences. And I always count, I don't know Andy, but I always count on Shai to do stuff, to teach me stuff that from angles that I didn't think about. I'm sure Safra didn't think about this when they gave him the mandate to. They talk about corruption labs and all these things, and they get loss and preservation, which is kind of nice. Anyway, so our first speaker is Professor Irus Braverman. Irus is a professor of law and adjunct professor of geography at SUNY Buffalo Law School. She is a very prolific author. She authored many books and articles. I'll name a few of them. One, which I read, which is great, Planted Flags, Trees, Land and Law in Israel-Palestine. The second is Zooland, the Institution of Captivity. And her latest book is titled Wildlife. She can show them the book. Yeah. Wildlife, the Institution of Nature. She also co-audited many books. Irus will talk to us about the death and life of threatened species lists. Irus.
Thanks, Shai and Andy, for inviting me here, and to thank Natalia for your comments that are coming up, and to all of you for making it here. So what I'm going to present today is part of a chapter from a forthcoming book collection that I'm editing that is entitled Animals, Biopolitics, Law. And I guess if somebody can lend me those little thingies that you have, I can tell you which slide I'm referring to. So we're moving to the second slide on the right, Animals, Bio. That's it's a beautiful image, and that's a forthcoming with Routledge. So this is a work in progress. I'm really looking forward to your comments about it. It's also an extension of a book that just came out a few weeks ago, Wildlife, the Institution of Captivity. Now I've got Stanford sent me with flyers with reduced prices, and then they sent me flyers for my previous book, so we've got a lot of flyers here. If anybody's interested, you can come. There's beautiful postcards, and they worked pretty hard, but I'm always a little embarrassed to give them out. But so feel free to come later and grab some. So just to say that wildlife, I think, is also very relevant to this conference. Wildlife explores the distinction between in situ and ex situ conservation, conservation in the so-called wild and conservation in captivity. So I interviewed over 120 conservation biologists and wildlife managers, and also it kind of builds on my previous book on zoos. So it's kind of an extension or a sequel to Zooland, the Institution of Captivity. This is Wildlife, the Institution of Nature. So you can see, well, the book cover you can probably see better here, and also in the slides. So this I see as kind of an extension of that project. Now, it also ties in with some of the other papers about the relationship between lab and between field and between our artificialia and naturalia, themes that seem to kind of be underlying the other papers. So for my talk today, I'll describe the paper for the forthcoming book about the regulation of endangerment through listing. So we'll start with the Cebu Flowerpecker. This is the bird on the right in the bottom of the first page. The cebu is a native bird of the island of Cebu in the Philippines. In the 1960s, this bird was listed as extinct by the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. So you see the red list on the second page. And the image of the red list categories right beside it on the right. So it was listed as extinct, which you see in the top of that second slide on the right. All right. Now, in the 1990s, the bird was rediscovered, and as a result, it was relisted or reclassified as critically endangered. So it was kind of going down on the list to critically endangered. And currently, the Cebu Flowerpecker is believed to be one of the 10 rarest birds in the world. Now, scientists call this a Romeo error. They believe that the impact of the listing on the bird actually caused the bird's near extinction. So the fact that the list declared it as extinct, scientists claim, actually made it extinct or near extinct because nobody gave it any attention or any money. So this, I wanted to give this as an example of the actual impacts that listing, the process of listing has on animal bodies or species. Now this self-fulfilling prophecy is just one example for such impact. There are also adverse effects to listing. So to listing like a species as endangered. So for example, the price of the rhino horn on Korean markets increased by more than 400% within 2 years of their uplisting, from CITES Appendix 2 to CITES Appendix 1, which in turn resulted in a sharp increase in the poaching of black rhinos and in illegal trade in rhino horn. So you can see some of the products of the rhino horn on the second page, bottom left image. So here we see that actually more legal protection kind of counterintuitively resulted in more death for the particular animals involved. And similar effects were recorded with regard to rare species targeted for illegal collection, such as the certain species of turtles you can see on the bottom image in that page. So these examples show that the act of listing threatened species impacts the life and death of actual animals. And typically, the more protection granted through the list and its regulatory regimes, the higher the value and the conservation of life. So although I already mentioned, those examples that I just gave are that kind of show how endangered species lists can also produce counterintuitive results. One way or the other, alongside their descriptive and declarative functions, threatened species lists prescribe a series of material effects on very particular animal bodies. They also normalize and regulate conservation and related actions on the part of specific humans and networks. So my paper studies list making as a form of global governance, focusing in particular on the IUCN Red List of endangered species, or threatened species, as both a regulatory and a biopolitical, in the Foucauldian sense, technology. So why has the list become such a prevalent technology for species conservationists, and why is it such a ubiquitous form of biopolitical governance? These are kind of the questions that underlie my paper. So we're moving to the bottom. Oh, actually, we can start with the top on page 3. So definition of lists. What are lists? The word lists originates from edge or boundary. List making is one of the fundamental activities of human society and a component of many laws. Lists come in various shapes, sizes, and functions. Kill lists, image on the right, sex offender lists, to-do and to-don't lists, and lists of threatened species all share certain properties. They are consecutive configurations of discrete items linked by a common goal that assigns them meaning and functionality. So if you had trouble remembering all these, they're in the bottom slide on the right. All right. Lists name, classify, document, and simplify. They aspire to comprehensiveness, comparability, consistency, and uniformity. They're also structured to delineate boundaries, produce authority, and promote visibility. Making a list is a way to make something apparent that is not otherwise so. Whereas all lists rely on classification and on sorting things out, some do more than that. Some lists also prioritize. So in addition to listing the item, there's also significance to the particular placement of the item and the particular orders of the placement. So there's a few types of lists, right? So I'm going to talk here about the red list, which is by far the most influential and widely used of all threatened species lists. It was established in the 1960s by the important environmental organization, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, otherwise called the IUCN. And what I'm going to do is explore some of the properties as I identify them of the red list. So the properties are biopolitical, that's number one. Then the hybrid function of the list as a database. So list database hybrid, right? Then its global dimensions, its scientific dimensions, and finally what I call the listing list property, this kind of proliferation of lists and more lists and more lists, all right? So I'll start with the biopolitical front. Thinking and governing through species lists enables both an abstraction, a grid over the Linnaean kingdoms, and an embodiment. It puts a face on ecosystems, habitats, and populations. Since humans understand themselves primarily as a species and therefore both relate to and differentiate themselves from other species, it is important to critically examine the species lens and the work that it does in the conservation world. For conservation scientists, specifically species conservation scientists, the species is the foundational ontological unit through which life can be calculated and known. According to this way of thinking, the death of an individual animal gains meaning based on the level of endangerment of her or his species. Once on the brink of extinction, here I have a very dramatic image of the rhino, that you're going to see a small image of it here. Actually, the reason why Chagai couldn't show it to his children, Chagai, here and there. Anyway, he said he almost showed the PowerPoint presentation to his little kids, and then he saw that rhino. So it's the page 5, the rhino on the right there. So on the brink of extinction, right? This kind of image elicits that response. So once on the brink of extinction, the individual becomes larger than a singular life, and her or his death become larger than a singular death. It's the death of a life form. It's basically the death of nature. Non-human life is measured numerically, and here you can see in the bottom like some of the numbers that are used by conservation scientists, bottom left, and valued according to its place in the scheme of the threatened list. The use of the species as the foundational unit of threatened lists is not only ideological, I argue, but also pragmatic. Threatened species are among the most visible and easily understood symbols of the rising tide of extinction, making them, and I'm quoting here, emotive and politically powerful measurements of biodiversity loss. So you can see an IUCN slide of help us using kind of different species in the slide bottom, page 5, bottom right. But then, as one IUCN officer had mentioned to me in an interview, not all threatened species are created equally. He explained that, and I'm quoting, even if you list a whole lot of dragonflies on the red list, they're not going to suddenly get as much attention as a panda. We have lots of biases, explained another official. The system is still very much biased towards vertebrates. Plants, fungi, and invertebrates are underrepresented. In other words, even if a species is listed as threatened, this does not promise it equal protection in relation to other listed species. Other criteria and less formal lists, in fact, determine which species are more or less worth saving. The deaths of so many other life forms who are not species, and here you can see kind of some examples on the top, page 6, top left. Or if they are species, they're not rare, or they're not charismatic, or they're not visible enough to warrant the threatened designation, they fall outside of the range of protections established by the list, or outside of the list altogether. Such life forms are effectively listless, incalculable, unmemorable, and therefore killable, in Judith Butler's terms, all right? So this was kind of the biopolitical, this was the biopolitical aspect. Now I'm moving to the data list hybrid, the data lists. I'm gonna come back to this list, right? That I'm using because I actually question that later. So I argue that, and then I kind of counter-argue that in a second. But okay, so data lists. Another important property of the red list is its function as a list data hybrid. In 1994, the IUCN revised its expert-based risk ranking system into a data-driven quantitative system. This kind of in the words of the IUCN, right? Today, the red list classifies taxa into 9 categories. So you have the 9 categories again on page 6, bottom left. I don't know if you can see, well, you have from the top extinct to the bottom not evaluated. So each of these 9 categories contains a list of species, but not only species, also a huge range of information that can be traced through the Red List's online database, with one exception. The category of not evaluated includes no data, basically, because it's just names of those species that are not evaluated. And so I think that's a very interesting category, the not evaluated category. Anyway, within the threatened categories, in order for a species to become threatened, they need to go through kind of a criteria tests. And the IUCN applies 5 criteria listed A through E, and these criteria measure the level and symptoms of endangerment. And I gave an example of criteria A from the critically endangered. In order for a species to be listed as critically endangered, you can see it in the bottom right on page 6, and then on the top left on page 7. This is just one criteria within one category. It's very detailed, very regulated, which I think goes hand in hand with the biopolitical project, right? All right. The Red List arguably highlights the inseparable relationship between modern lists and databases. It demonstrates how the list may become a database. Also, you can see kind of how the online database looks like. Page 7, top image on the right, and then bottom image on the left. And also how the IUCN kind of session in full looks like at the bottom. By 2013, thousands of scientists and experts from around the world, IUCN experts, evaluated the global threat status of approximately 71,000 species of animals, plants, and fungi. Now, the goal is to assess and categorize every living species on Earth. In other words, the Red List aspires to be a barometer of life. And actually, these are the terms used by top IUCN officials in my interviews with them. So one of the officials that I spoke with clarified that the Red List is actually not about threatened species. It's about all species. In his words, you can't talk about the status of biodiversity globally unless you've assessed everything, close quote. The Red List applies one system to all species. Its criteria and categories apply across the board, whether the species assessed is a fungi or a whale. This is the one-size-fits-all approach. It also means that one can make comparisons between the different species and between different taxonomic groups. So in addition to its role in constructing a governable platform between different species, the Red List also provides comparability over time. It makes possible grand comparisons like the ones that you can see in the graph on page 8, top left. So you can see how the corals are going down, amphibians are going down. And you mentioned the story in Colbert's book about the amphibian, right? And there is actually an amphibian arc. It's a very interesting story, and I speak about it in my book. So yeah, frogs are going down, but look at corals. And so you can kind of make those taxonomic comparisons, right? Because the Red List enables that kind of simplification. It similarly makes possible statements such as, open quote, on average, 52 species of mammals, birds, and amphibians move one category closer to extinction each year. The red list is also an example, a classic example for global governance. So an IUCN scientist told me, and I'm quoting, when you say this species is red listed by the IUCN as critically endangered, everyone automatically agrees. That's it. End of story. And indeed, the IUCN Red List is considered one of the most authoritative sources of information on the global conservation status of plants and animals. Its influence has extended into numerous national and international regulatory systems. Specifically, 76 countries use the IUCN methodology for their national red lists, and I just heard that in Israel it's also becoming a very, in the last 10, 15 years, a very powerful tool for environmental change, for mobilizing environmental change. The red list is also an important source for the Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. It's always a difficult one to say. Basically, in short, CITES, a very important treaty, right? And for the Convention on Biological Diversity, again, an important treaty. The IUCN Red List is really foundational for those two treaties. But why does the IUCN Red List work on this global scale? So one of the founders of the Red List, Georgina Macy, says the IUCN Red List assesses the status of species at a global level, right? And Etienne, I think this kind of resonates with your paper, because this is the scale at which extinction occurs. So simple, right? Extinction occurs globally. Well, not so simple as we know. Then that's how it should be assessed. And this also makes intense use with what some have called catastrophe governance, right? This is the mode that a lot of conservationists use. Catastrophe governance. I have images of how conservationists kind of display, or the imageries that they use to convince their publics that we're in the age of extinction, basically. And I think that ties to the global scale at which the Red List operates. So let's move to the scientific dimensions. Right, remember I did kind of biopolitical data, the data list hybrid, the global list, and now the scientific list. So during the 5 decades of its use, the Red List has evolved from a subjective system lacking standardized criteria to a uniform and global rule-based system. And this brings me to another aspect, and that is the Red List's kind of presenting itself as being apolitical, neutral, we're familiar with that, right? Apolitical, neutral, and of course scientific. So also, I've kind of in my work, I've realized that it's becoming increasingly algorithmic. In addition to being really obsessed about numbers in certain ways, and maybe we can talk about that later. So according to the guidelines for appropriate uses of IUCN Red List data, and I'm quoting, the IUCN Red List is developed through contributions from a network of thousands of scientific experts around the world. It uses a scientific process, and if we didn't understand yet, it uses objective criteria. Assessments, this again is a quote, are impartial, independent, and not politically driven, okay? So the insistence that the Red List is never political, but only scientific, exposes the underlying ideal that science describes nature and nature alone, and that politics is about social power and social power alone. And here I'm quoting from Bowker and Starr. The list's visibility, accessibility, and transparency thus work to conceal its underlying political ideologies and value-based judgments, which we can talk about later. So lastly, I want to talk about the listing lists dimension, the contagious aspect of making lists. And actually the DSM, it surprised me to find out, has coined a term for list-making obsessions. They call it glazomania. So just so we know what we have, right? So this is what it's called. And I think, it's really apparent when you're starting to work on lists that there's lists everywhere. It's just incredible. So if the Red List has a particular focus of identifying all threatened species from an ever-growing list of known species, other lists now supplement this by identifying alternative targets for maintaining biodiversity. In this way, various lists intersect, feed each other, become consolidated, disseminated, and translated. For example, the Alliance for Zero Extinction, and there's a slide somewhere. I've kind of lost track of the slides. Zero Extinction is probably page 11, bottom right. Really interesting organization. The Alliance for Zero Extinction aims to identify all sites around the globe that serve as the single remaining location for an endangered or critically endangered. So they take just one part of the red list, and where it's the last final location of that particular very rare species, that's what they focus on when there's one place that species exists. Again, the ontological focus is species under this kind of paradigm. So there's another organization called EDGE of the Zoological Society of London, and EDGE lists only those red list species that possess a significant amount of unique evolutionary history. So you see there's like parsing out by other lists on top of the red list. Despite their common origin in the red list, the various conservation lists differ in their perspective on what is most important about life, and thus what is most worth saving, be it rarity in numbers, unique territorial configurations, or evolutionary variation. Rather than a bifurcated understanding of life versus death, then, conservation lists parse the life of species into much more complicated orderings according to the extinction risks they face. This, in turn, establishes a hierarchy of animal bodies according to how much they are worth saving. Even among those species deemed threatened, categories and criteria prioritize the ones who are perceived to be the most threatened of all, those whose lives are even more, and then finally most worth saving. Thank you.
Natalia is a PhD candidate at the Porter School of Environmental Studies and the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here at Tel Aviv University. She was a fellow at the Safra Center for Ethics, Tel Aviv in 2013-14, and recently returned from a visiting fellowship at the Department of Anthropology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. It's a wonderful landscape there. In the woods, it's actually...
Very inspiring.
I went there once. What?
Very inspiring.
When at Stanford, yeah. On September 2015, she will continue her academic relations with the Safra Center, but this time at Harvard, the Corruption Center, right? The Corruption Lab.
No, but next year they're not working on corruption. Next year it's diversity,
Impossible.
justice, and democracy. This is where I fit in, not the corruption
Not
part.
working on corruption. It's everywhere.
Thank you, Andy and Shai, for organizing the conference. Irus, thank you for a beautiful paper, very thought-evoking. To Chagai and Limor for putting this event together, and for all of you for being here. I have to say that coming from being trained at the School of Environmental Studies, where words like conservation and sustainability are like the holy Bible to some of the members of the community, it's very thought-evoking to be in the last few years in the process of questioning these concepts. Irus Braverman's essay, The Regulatory Life of Threatened Species Lists, explores the regulatory frameworks of listing threatened species through the IUCN Red List. This research focus should have preoccupied political ecologists and social scientists a long time ago, as it evokes and triggers so many fascinating questions which Irus's research unfolds. I'm very glad for this opportunity to think further with your work. In this article, Irus Braverman argues that threatened species lists are both biopolitical and regulatory technologies. They produce and reinforce species ontologies by making and governing the boundary between the human and the non-human, and they also reinforce the biopolitical differentiation between non-human species. The paper examines the biopolitical aspects of the IUCN's Red List for Threatened Species, including its global, regulatory, scientific, and seductive powers. The questions at the center of the essays are: why does the red list have such normative powers, and how does it work in the world? I think the paper also reflects on the question on how is nature actually done in the 21st century? How is it done? How is it regulated? And I think most of my comments would refer to the second question of what work does it do in the world. I will offer now several observations and raise a few questions regarding the essay. The regulatory life of threatened species lists is framed by Irus as the regulatory projects of lists ordering life and the technologies of biopolitics. It discusses how certain species are granted political lives while others, the unlisted, are simply rendered as non-human biological life. I read this claim as pointing to the power and agency that some non-human nature has and to the active role that it may take in society. Such observation harks to the material turn in science studies and anthropology, which emphasizes the agency and power of the non-human, thereby problematizing the conventional understanding of life in a close line to the endeavor of the paper. Therefore, I would like to hear you explore, how do you see the listed species? Are they absolute objects, or do they have an agency of their own which is more interactive in the scientific practice of listing? I wondered about the agency of the species throughout the paper, especially as you mentioned how scientists' career depend on listing their species. I read this as a co-emergence, as an interaction in science. The scientists produce the endangered species list, but in return, those species are the ones that make them human. They make them scientists. They make them the subject whose scholarship is worthy of publishing, funding, etc. This is an entanglement, an interaction that the feminist science studies scholar Karen Barad refers to. In this vein, since Foucault's biopolitics are the basis for the offered analysis, I would like to refer to Donna Haraway's critique of Foucault. Haraway claims that Foucault's notions of biopolitics are incapable of taking into account the new scientific practices that continually rework the boundaries between the human and the non-human. I found Haraway's critique of Foucault meaningful to your work in highlighting the shakiness and fluidity of these categories of classification within the context of emerging technoscientific practices. As such, we may ask what work technoscience does to this classificatory status of species, which is the basic ontological unit of the discussion here. So what happens when the categories of species themselves are much more slippery than we first think of? And let me illustrate this slipperiness using two examples. Anthropologists Marian Lin and John Law discussed the problems that aquaculture of Atlantic salmon poses in Norway to scientific and environmental writing, since experts disagreed on the classificatory order of the Atlantic salmon as new domesticated salmons are being created. So now, a new classificatory category emerged, wild Atlantic salmon. This classification grants us that this is the real thing, as opposed to the domesticated farmed one. But alas, these populations interbreed. And what happens, therefore, what a severe problem is created when one of these domesticated salmons escapes the cage and goes up the river to find a beautiful mate there. What would happen to these classifications? Consequently, the species boundaries are unstable and categorical distinctions are hard to maintain. Think in this case of the agency, again, of the power of the farmed salmon going up the river, how he impacts this science. According to Lin and Law, the new classificatory species regime of the salmon ignores the real intervention in salmon lives, which is a whole century of human-salmon interactions, even before the emergence of the aquaculture in the last decades. So this is a pretty slippery ontology, isn't it? Their analysis points out to the slippery classification even prior to domestication of salmon, one which considers a longer period of human-salmon relations. But if I should follow the IUCN Red List logic, I just wasted a minute of all of your time talking on the slippery classification of the Atlantic salmon, which is a species classified of least concern. So we shouldn't even talk about him so much. What a waste of our shared public resource of time and attention. So let us speak now of more important species. The second example comes from the case of cloning endangered species, which is the case researched by the sociologist Carrie Fries. In her recent book, Fries researched the debates revolving the cloning of wildlife. the case of the Gaur, or the Indian bison, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, cloned at the San Diego Zoo, included the incorporation of domestic animal egg cells and surrogates into the reproductive process of endangered species. Such practice raised questions about the classificatory status of the cloned animal. Given its biological and social link with domestic animals, could this animal be classified now as an endangered species? So these cloned endangered animals raise essential questions on the very definition of nature and of endangerment. And what is precisely in danger now if scientists are able to clone some of these animals? So we may acknowledge that the term species does the work of making order through simultaneously separating and holding together, but even the category of species is not as stable as we may think. The historian Louis Menand cites Darwin, who stated in The Origin of Species in 1859 that, "I look at the term species as one arbitrarily given for the sake of convenience to a set of individuals closely resembling each other." Darwin's approach to species highlighted relations rather than categories. This differs from the naturalist approach that prevailed at that time, which defined species on the base of an ideal type. Another theme that I would like to relate to, and you wrote about it more in the paper and discussed this less here, is the comparison between human and non-human lists. The analysis offered in the paper indicates that while in the human case it is an identification of humans who risk or threaten, such as sex offender or terrorist lists, the species list identifies non-humans who are threatened. However, I would like to hear your exploration of that point in light of the professional ecological terminology of invasive species. The term of invasive species is a very, very central term in ecological terminology, and of course the biological subjects of such classification are also managed and calculated, but some of their management techniques are also those of uprooting and killing those species. So since that sort of terminology is the one that stands together with biodiversity loss and so forth, I think that comparison is a bit more shaky. So in this case, it is another similarity and comparability between the ecological species lists and the human who threat lists. Now, although the IUCN list is not classifying invasiveness, it is grounded on that parallel terminology. So, to finalize, I would also like to offer an additional layer to the order of things, the order of life that the red list records. In the essay, it is argued that listing threatened species becomes a way to affirm and justify which lives are more and most important to save, and to reify the distinction between those who save humans and those who can only be saved non-humans. I wondered whether conservation efforts may also endanger human lives, actually. So current anthropological and agrarian studies suggest and look at the cases where environmental organizations and private funds are so moved by the crying rally for conservation that they're buying land in poor countries where hotspots of biodiversity are identified. That term is coined in the social sciences as green grabbing. So in that case, for the sake of conservation efforts, human communities are dispossessed of their lands and their homes in a very growing matter, which is documented in many of the agrarian journals. If this is the case, the order of things of the life that we're documenting here should be a little different. Maybe the list should include 4 categories. First, human species with access to science, policy, influence, and economic funds. Second, endangered non-human species. Third, the downgraded human species who lack access to science, policy, and funds. And fourth, and unlisted, and the last, most unimportant, are the unlisted. Thank you.
All right, let's see if I can if I can address some of these great comments. Really, thank you. So let's start with Foucault. Because I've kind of been challenged a lot for my use of Foucault in my work. It starts with Zooland, where I use Foucault's pastoral power as a framework to think about the management of zoo animals. And there already Foucauldians, classical Foucauldians, were enraged with how I could even apply Foucault to non-humans. And I insisted that even though Foucault may have not done that, I insisted to use the biopolitics or pastoral power in that instance to think through governing zoo animals using both an idea of power and care, that combination that I thought was very powerful in Foucault's work. Now, in this sequel, in Wildlife, I'm using the biopolitical, and I, again, am insisting to use Foucault. I think biopolitics does take different shapes and forms, and I'm most familiar with the Foucauldian one, and I think it just really helps me think through a lot of the issues. That doesn't mean that I'm endorsing Foucault's way of thinking. Actually, in a way, it's kind of an implicit critique of Foucault, but you have to kind of do Foucault in order to critique him, in my point of view. And yeah, Foucault did not apply, like Donna Haraway said, he doesn't apply it to non-humans. He has a very humanistic framework, and I am urging people to push the Foucauldian framework to question even the divide, the human-non-human divide. Even, who knows, the divide between living and non-living. There's a lot of divides that we can talk about, right? And all of them should be questioned. All right, so why is it important for me to use Foucault? I mean, I had this discussion with Wendy Brown, who really, for about a year when we were together at Cornell last year, and Judith Butler, for that matter, they actually thought I shouldn't be using Foucault at all, and just don't use that term. But I emerged out of that discussion thinking that it's actually very important to maybe, the term moves, changes. The term is not static. Anyway, so that's kind of to my use of Foucault. I don't know if that addresses exactly your question, but maybe. All right. The issue of the wild versus domesticated, or wild versus captive, with the salmon example that you gave, is a very important one right now in the fish farming industry in the United States, for various reasons. Now, the question in U.S. courts has become how to categorize. So the idea is that they don't want the salmon, or there are actually a few other fish that are farmed and harvested in so-called captive environments, and the idea is that if they are seen as protected, then it's going to be less easy to deal with them. There's going to be more limitations. And so the question is how to classify those captive or domesticated species, how to count them. Are they counted when we count whether the species is endangered or not, or do they not count because they're domesticated, therefore they lose their identity as the ambassadors. So that's become a legal question. Actually, the courts had to, and there were a lot of neoliberal capitalist issues involved with this industry that wanted to actually delist rather than uplist, and so wanted. So there were various interests here at stake with whether to include the fish inside the status of endangered or not. That's called split listing in the legal terminology there. And actually, there's a whole chapter in my book that discusses that whole interrelations. So I'm glad that you pointed to that. I think that the wild captive distinction is really important when we kind of think, how do conservationists imagine what they're saving, right? So that's, my whole book is actually dedicated to that distinction. And I don't remember if that was related to the agency question or if that was a separate question, but let me address the agency question for a second. when I interviewed scientists, it was really interesting that it seemed like they weren't talking in terms of agency, right? Of the species. They did say some of them that, like when I asked why are you so into the Puerto Rican crested toad, this ugly toad that comes out 5 days a year, you can't see it for 360, and they dedicate the lives to it. Where does that passion and intimacy come from? And they kind of, there was love, there was charisma, there was some kind of connection, intimacy that some of them spoke in terms of the animal called them. So there was that kind of recognition of the animal's actancy or agency or whatever. We don't necessarily want to talk in those liberal terms, but we know that we don't want to go there, right? But that also the animal has its life world, right? That we can't impose ours on them, and that recognition actually came when we were discussing captivity. Is captivity the same for a cheetah and for a snail, or for a, so basically recognition of that an animal is not just an animal, that there is no such thing, that there's different contexts and relations. So I think that goes to the direction of agency. Invasive species. Yes, I totally actually acknowledge the power of that discourse, which is questioned a little bit now in scientific quarters. But what I was saying, my argument there. Okay, I'll cut it. I think that's probably my last one too. One before last. So my argument was, so for people who didn't read the paper, was that the threatened list is actually thinking about who's threatened, while kill lists think about human kill lists are listing those who threaten. And I say that with humans, a lot of the times that's what's done. The risk of somebody being threatening rather than being threatened, and the threatened being passive and the threatening being active, and that kind of distinction again that reinforces the human non-human distinction. I recognize that with invasive species, it's exactly the paradigm of they are the threatening, right? They threaten the purity. There's a lot of, they threatened, and I talk about that. But I don't think that's the majority. The majority of threatened are actually the passive. The invasive species are there, but they're not the majority of the paradigm. So there are different paradigms going on there. And lastly, to the order of things, the kind of environmental racism, imperialism, fascism, however it was termed by different people. It's there. Like my girl just told me last, I don't understand why there's so many humans around. Why can humans be more endangered? But then you see those graphs with humans going up and, other species going down. That's another portrayal of this kind of endangerment. Thank you.
Thank you, Irus. Thank you, Natalia. This was opening. Now we'll take 15 minutes for discussion, open discussion. We may collect a few questions so that there's more of a discussion going on, and we'll probably need to cut the break a bit short. Is that too difficult to do? So, yes.
Sorry. So I can't help thinking when I'm listening a couple of things. Listening to this paper. So the paper that I circulated deals with non-humans, but I think a lot about humans, and specifically indigenous communities classed as indigenous, who are seen as vulnerable and threatened and endangered. And it's it was interesting for me to try to think through as I was listening to your paper and the distinctions you make about humans are the ones that do the threatening and non-humans are the ones that are threatened. And I started to think not so much about the non-humans, but the ways in which humans themselves wind up being categorized and perhaps not listed. But it made me think about the questions of vulnerability that are implied and that really have consequence for questions of ethics and how who gets to count as vulnerable and how does vulnerability both function to make somebody seem is vulnerability something that's different when it's applied to humans or non-humans as an indigenous community that's vulnerable mark of vulnerability and institutional bioethics, through institutional bioethics, does that then give them a kind of power? And so I just wondered, thinking through these categories on the human side, thinking about vulnerability, how is that distributed? And is it more striated or variable across those domains, or if that's a concept that you've worked with or thought about at all?
You want to take a few, right?
Well, it depends on whether the next one is related or totally unrelated. Do you want to answer shortly on this, or do you want? We can collect more. I could ask a question, or Andy could ask a question. Andy, you ask it.
Okay. It's actually not that related, but we'll add mine to the pile. So I wanted to ask you about the relationship between biopolitics and let's call it bioethics, and in particular, your talk focuses on this regulatory capacity of the list, as well as the sort of scientific discourse of objectivity through which these vast accumulations of lists of species are accrued. And the question I kept on asking myself as I was reading was, okay, under what circumstances can this become a value-based politics in which, in fact, some action is taken to preserve this particular species out of the tens of thousands of species we could think we are preserving? And I was wondering I want to hear a little bit more about, mainly for the scientists, but also possibly for policymakers, what the implicit or explicit value is that they invoke when making the case that indeed a species should be preserved. So is it just the very fact that species have a right to exist on their own terms? Is there some relationship to certain kinds of species that humans have that might be based on traditions, or might be based on aesthetics, or might be based on even the value of tourism in a given area? So I just wanted to hear a little bit more about the value dimension of decisions about which species to prioritize.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on this cue and sort of make the reactionary point. Perhaps the objective aspect or scientific aspect of the list is extremely important. Scientists should sort of, the challenge would go something like this: species are natural kinds, or species terms are natural kind terms. And what scientists do is list these natural kinds, and all species are born equal just because the distinctions that, like cuteness, size, and so forth, are not scientific terms. So interesting or humanly, and so on and so forth, and that enables or gives the list a part of its status and standing, because it's not simply a pretense, but it's an ethos that they should keep loyal to. And then the questions like who do we preserve, and what we can do with the list should come in from at a different point or from a different.
So that's exactly the IUCN answer to your question. That the list is actually valueless, right? It's value neutral, right? That it's scientific, and then there's another list. That's the political list. This is the scientific list, right? So again, those are separated. That's the classic, narrative here. But I didn't mean to jump in.
I actually want to follow on this. So we start the article with the notion that what is central here is the notion of a list, and if listing, and this is just one list, but there are other listings, and by the end of the paper, I was wondering whether anything was left from the notion of a list, but for the name, the list. So I think that there are other metaphors that come, not just metaphors. I guess the list is both a metaphor and an instrument, and a way of organizing knowledge, and also a way of thinking about loss and action. So all these together. But as the paper develops, we get other things instead of a list. We first get a graph, because it's not just a list. There's more and less, and so it's graph. Then we get a map, because it's not just the local, it's the global. Then we get not just a map and a graph, but a barometer, which suggests that there's actually movement and change in this, and this is another way of thinking about this. A database, which also has a different sense, and eventually I think by the end of this, you think maybe even calling it extinction is not the issue, because if you have too much of a kind, that's as problematic as having too little. I mean, from this logic, so we move from global warming to climate change, right? So that the point isn't that there's less or there's more of something, but rather the fact that there's this fluidity is actually what is at stake, and what's actually the problem or the emergency. And so from this, I want to actually ask you about this tension. And you use hybrid, but I don't think that hybrid actually captures what seems to me to be much more of a contrast and a tension. And I wanted to ask you if this is true, that these are at least two different models, the list and then this other thing that's actually evolving. That what are the implicit different notions of loss and preservation implicit in this, right? Because when you have a list, there's a certain sense of loss, and when you have a more complicated barometer, it's a different, I think, sense of what exactly is going on. Not the individual species, but the ecology or something. And then also, and this ties back to the questions you were just asked, which is what are the political implications? When you need to defend a species from a list, that's a very different politics than when you have these things all the time in constant change, not just here, in different places in the world, not just information that's relevant, but all the information. And so, partly you answered this when you said that we need two different lists, but one list for action and one list for knowledge.
Okay, I'm gonna have to stop here. I don't think I can remember anymore. I'm gonna start with a question about moving between humans and non-humans and vulnerability. I don't take it on so much here. This is just a really small part of the project. I take it. I think the article where I really explore the fluidity between the human, non-human, biopolitical aspects is the one. I don't know if we spoke about it last night or if you were part of the conversation at that point, but the one I wrote in August 2014 about Gaza, and how categories of and it's not published yet. Hard to find a place actually to publish that one. So how categories of animality and humanness don't necessarily have to do with being an animal and being a human, but travel in between and dehumanize certain humans and humanize certain animals. So dogs are placed over Palestinian children because they can go out and catch the children, and or insects are placed below. So there's like a range of human and non-human agents, who are kind of traveling in this realm, and you see that it just creates and recreates those hierarchies. But what the biopolitical framework helps me to do is recognize that there's values attached to each one. So admittedly, cultural values, because insects are at the bottom, and then come, and Palestinian children are like insects, so they actually are insects, hence they are killable, whereas a Palestinian child, a Jewish child is the one and only Daniel, and has a name and has a political life. So I explore a lot of those fluidities, I think, in that particular article. And so, yeah, I recognize that being threatened is, too simplistic to be like an overall. But I think as a paradigm, it's there. Usually when humans use lists, the kill lists, that's what the literature has been focusing on surveillance of humans through lists. So when we're looking at lists in that context, and actually this paper started out like in a collection for that purpose. And so I kind of tried to distinguish kill lists from threatened species lists. That's where that comment was coming from. So kind of to... Now, I do think that indigenous vulnerabilities, in a way, there's that tension that you pointed to. There's more protection, yet there is also this naturalization of the indigenous, so an inferiority in a way, right? because again, it passivizes, it kind of, so I mean, these are also questions that emerge in the human rights context, right? Yeah, I think the tension is there, I agree, right? And I think the next question was yours, Andy. You were asking about value-based politics. So this is a really contentious question right now. Actually, there's a group of economists, I just interviewed them when I was in Australia 2 weeks ago, because they're really hated in the conservation community, in the traditional species conservation community, because they're actually claiming that we need to put a monetary value on how much, like, okay, so we have 3 rhinos. How much money are we going to put to save the northern white rhino that we have 4 left of, versus putting that money into species that maybe have more chance of actually surviving it? Because clearly those 4 rhinos, even if they survive for 100 more years, that's it. That's like, you know, in a way, the individuals can't represent the population anymore because they don't have the genetic diversity, etc. So they raised those questions really explicitly, Hugh Possingham and his group in Australia. And what the IUCN people answer, so Simon Stewart, the head of the Species Commission, so he's kind of in charge of this, he basically told me, my list is not political. I count exactly what Yuval, your name is? What Yuval was saying. We're just counting, and we're doing an objective process, and countries do not take our list as a political list. You go and make your own decisions based on this counting. It doesn't mean that the animal that is most endangered needs to get the most money. But then it is translated that way, and they recognize that there's that tension, because endangerment is actually, I would argue with you, Shai, endangerment is the underlying motivation for this list's existence. Not invasiveness, not the too many, but endangerment. I think it has a lot of power, that narrative. Speaking about loss, why do we it's there all the time. It's so-called natural, right? So why do we take it so seriously that, actually that is used by a lot of the Anthropocene kind of, environmentalists that are taking that direction. Like, there's been extinction all the time. Oh, a little bit more here. Well, we can always kind of raise them from the dead, do de-extinction, etc. So I'm simplifying, of course, but those are existing narratives that question the extensive obsession with endangerment and extinction in species conservation. Actually, a lot of species conservationists now are saying, you know what, people are tired of hearing about extinction. It's so morbid. Let's do a little bit more of let's focus on the green list. Actually, there's a green list now. So the red list is the alert list, right? The green list gives us kind of a pleasant imagery. We're focusing on the successes. So let's buy the public this way, because we're giving. So another list, right? Now there's also a red list for ecosystems. So and it's actually a newer list and not as well. It's not as powerful because of the reasons that I think I kind of mentioned. But there is a movement towards acknowledging habitats and relations, but still, I would argue that the list, as a technology, also influences how things are made to seem, right? The list has a linear and progressive kind of nature to it, so it splices things in a very particular way. And so, by the way, does the graph and the barometer. They're all very linear, and they all have this hierarchical ranking idea behind them. They're not very relational, or Deleuze and Guattari will probably put them in kind of one box. So I find, yes, there are other technologies that work, list, graphs. So I'm kind of moving to answer Shai. List, graphs, maps, but they all do share something in common, and I don't see the list as the only technology that is at work here. Yes, there are many other technologies that are reinforcing, actually. A lot of them do not challenge the list. They help each other create this kind of narrative. I think that about covers all the questions.
And I think, unfortunately, this also brings us to the end of this this.
Okay,
session.
great.
Thank you, Iris.
Thank you so much.